Thank you. Right, good evening, everyone. Great to be back. We'll just take our seats, and we're going to hear, based on what we've just heard from Norman and from Nick, hear it very much from the horse's mouth now, as we always do, from a great panel this evening. Again, we've got a great crowd, as Jim was saying. I think it's testament to the quality of the speakers we get at these events, but of course to the importance of an issue like this one. And I think some of the numbers we've heard already, and some of the numbers we'll continue to hear, are alarming, to say the least. As always, it's very easy to highlight the problem, a little less easy to have you leave the room with a clear idea of really what needs to be done now beyond ticking boxes. So that is our challenge tonight. And whenever I sit down with Jim ahead of these events, the main question I ask him is, look, what do you want the audience to leave feeling after these events? So it'll be very interesting to hear in the roundtables what you feel about this. A couple of other points very quickly before we get stuck in. Analysis by NGOs of corporate responses to providing human rights statements. I think they're very telling, these pieces of information from NGOs. This is a quote. They continue to focus overwhelmingly on compliance with legislation rather than any concrete action to tackle the issue of forced labor. So again, it comes back to this idea of how do we move beyond compliance. I don't normally mention the organization I work for. In fact, Nick very kindly did it for me. But integrity and trust principles come into play, seeing as I represent Reuters and the news side. But Thomson Reuters is doing a lot in this space, and hopefully this evening, in terms of information and data gathering and big data, and hopefully this evening we'll get into just how important that is and how that can help in the whole process of reaching where we want to reach. Let me get to our panel, and what I'll do, as I normally do, very quickly give each one 2 or 3 minutes just to lay out their stand and then open it up into a panel discussion, hopefully as lively as possible, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with you at the end. Bennett Northcott is John Lewis's Director for Corporate Responsibility. I'll do this one by one. One of the first UK companies, Bennett, to publish a human rights statement. John Lewis has found labor issues in its own supply chain. We'll hear the same from IKEA in a minute. Most, from what I've read, agree that you handled this issue very well. Let me start with that. What does handling this well actually mean?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing has to be the poor individuals who are being, who are the subject of this criminality. And handling it well, I think, has to start with an assessment of what can you do for them as individuals. That involves working with the police very clearly early on. Because, make no mistake, this is criminal activity, and one must react to it as such. I think I could just talk about then the sort of classic corporate things around how you deal with the remediation from it. So the first action is not to say, okay, well, we're just going to delist that factory and walk away. Yeah. In fact, in the case I think you're referring to, we put a lot of effort to think is actually how can we keep this? Is there a role that we could be involved in within keeping the future of this going? In fact, it turns out there wasn't, because the level of criminal concealment was so high. Yeah. In the business. So that's in terms of how you manage it. I think behind your question really is the question, well, what are you doing then as a business to address the underlying causes of
I guess my question is, if I'll push it a little bit further, do you feel that John Lewis is doing enough?
Yes, but is that ever going to be enough to fully get to this on its own? No. So we are, we've started a program building on a lot of work that we've been doing around our major ethical trading initiatives to ensure that we have a series of programs that are addressing some of the core human rights issues in our supply chain that we think are there, and then focusing on those with specific beyond compliance approaches to address those, to do that. And it's important that we're then sharing those with people in the market to ensure we get out of there. So you say, are we doing enough? I think we are doing what we need to be doing as a business to go beyond just an auditing compliance project. The question behind your question, you say to a company, are you doing enough? Then you're sort of encouraging and incentivizing them down to an answer is, well, unless until I've audited absolutely everything to the nth degree.
Right.
But that's not how you're going to solve this problem.
Okay. Very quickly, you've said that, and we'll no doubt get into that in a second. You've said the challenging part of the Act is not complying with what it asks for, but complying with its spirit.
Absolutely.
What do you mean by that?
So, well, it's actually, I mean, under the terms of the legislation, for those who've read it, it's really straightforward. We could issue a statement which said we do absolutely nothing in our supply chain to address modern slavery, and we would be compliant with the law. So in terms of actually meeting the terms of the Modern Slavery Act, really it's very, very light touch in that sense. Why it's so cleverly drafted is, of course, because there's lots of NGOs and indeed people who are more morally minded, such as me, on this, who are going, but that's not good enough, right? And you surely have to open up the question, well, what are you doing, and is that credible?
Is it too woolly, the Modern Slavery Act, very quickly?
No, I think it's good. I think it's going to get tougher.
But there's room for to sort of a la carte in some ways, isn't it? Really?
It's opening the door for civil society to play its part too now. It's important now that the NGOs step up to the plate, scrutinise our reports, and come and tell us whether they're good enough or not.
Thank you very much indeed, Bennett. Natasha Dimitrijevic is Associate Director at Hermes Equity Ownership Services, so an investor's perspective. In fact, something we've tried to include at a number of these events. I remember we did the same with the SDG event. Natasha, you heard Bennett saying pretty much boiling it down to risk and opportunity is not the point. But from an investor's perspective, it is extremely important that. What is the risk to companies of not complying?
I believe so. Beyond the ethical base, which is non-negotiable, whether or not you invest in an ethical manner or not, we are not. We are totally mainstream. We have some funds that are probably more sustainably focused, but the bulk of the assets we represent are not. So beyond this case, what we see is that there's a sustainability case to tackling slavery in your supply chain. We view that as an indicator of the quality of the management. And as Nick was saying, if you have slavery in your supply chain and you're not paying attention to it, there also are probably many other type of issues around your supply chain. So how do you secure your value chain? What's the corruption issues, conflict of interest? All these are not tackled appropriately in the company. And so now that the regulatory framework is building up, so at European level, in the UK and in the US, we can see that there are increased chains of investigation, litigation, and fines, which has an impact. And lastly, I think that can have an impact on your bottom line as well.
Do you think, from an investor's perspective, that companies are putting enough effort into their human rights statements?
Oh, that is one thing that I'd like to highlight. It's that we are at the beginning of a journey, meaning that this agenda, this slavery and human rights agenda that we've taken on board, we've been discussing it and we've had it on our agenda for a while, but it is certainly taking another place in our priority rank. So I think for companies, it's the same. They have been very familiar probably with the OECD, the UN, the GRI framework and guidelines. But now the regulatory is giving another push, and we are starting to see proper human rights reports, seeing how that can be integrated in the reporting of the companies, how that can make sense with the strategy and risk management.
And investors are making decisions based on what they're seeing in those reports. Is that right?
Yeah, we are using this information, and we are also counting on a number of partners to help us understand, assess, benchmark, because we don't have internally all the knowledge. It's a very complex issue, and it's easy to take an easy, conclusion out of a scandal or something. We know it's more complex than that. So we're using this information in order to make our assessment of companies.
We will come back to that. Simon Henzell-Thomas is Head of Stakeholder Engagement and Sustainability Policy Manager at IKEA Group. We've heard, as I said at the top, some pretty alarming statistics, the number of companies who feel they can't see beyond tier 2. How far can you see into your supply chain, would you say?
I think that's the million-dollar question. I mean, the focus for IKEA and for many other companies has to be first to make sure your first tier is as good as you can make it. And then beyond that, we've taken an approach of focusing on materials where we feel we can have a big influence. So if you look at wood, for example, IKEA is the second biggest wood buyer in the world outside the paper and pulp sector, second biggest in cotton as well. So these are materials we feel we can have an impact on and where we feel we can get more visibility and actually also possibly even get more vertical integration. So you see, recently we announced buying forestry in Romania in order to get more proximity to some of the issues. The other thing we find is one of the best ways to get beyond the first tier is actually to encourage the suppliers to take ownership. And where we see it works is when there's a mind shift change in the suppliers, we find that the job gets done a lot better rather than us doing the job for them.
Are you prepared, though, to really do business differently, as Nick was talking about, and change the supplier if need be?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
And have you done that already?
Yes, many cases where we've done that. And I think that for me, this is where for me, there's no business case for slavery. There's no, the moral argument is compelling. And I think in most boardrooms, if you go in and give a moral argument, everyone will take that argument. The question is not that it's whether it's the right thing to do, the question is how. So absolutely there's cases where we have...
You know I'm going to raise the Turkmenistan and the cotton or bedding products that IKEA have used. H&M's, the Zara's, the Wranglers have terminated their relationship with the supplier in question. Has IKEA terminated its relationship with that supplier?
Not yet.
Why?
No. Because we believe in facts-based approaches. So our approach is going to be to conduct a thorough investigation. We had a target that all of our cotton would come from what we call more sustainable sources, which includes BCI cotton. So to our knowledge, that is what we have. So until we've investigated that 100% thoroughly ourselves, but then of course if we find anything untoward, then we will take
all right. Again, we'll come back to that. Nick, let me bring you into that. Doesn't that look bad that IKEA hasn't yet terminated that and all these other corporates, businesses have terminated it? Different standards.
I'm not familiar with the facts of that particular case, but no, it's not a solution just to immediately cut a supplier that does something wrong, right? It's about building, because what you want to do is change behavior, right? And it's way too easy just to cut off a supplier. Now, on the other hand, if you investigate that supplier and find really fundamental issues and still maintain a relationship, that's a big problem. But, you know, all of the suppliers operating in this environment are going to have challenges. And what I'm arguing about when we talk about changing business is actually investing and building the relationships that make it worth their while to do better. That takes long-term relationships. It's not an excuse for not doing anything, right? And you know, the fundamental obligation on businesses, I think, under the Modern Slavery Act is a willingness to properly investigate, a willingness to be transparent about that, and then a willingness to put in place practices that address it, not just cut and run. And Nestle, for instance, has had a deep investigation and came out with a report around problems and forced labour in its supply chain in Thailand. We came out and welcomed their willingness to talk publicly about this. If companies are just smacked around the head because they acknowledge there's a problem, then it gets buried. But of course, there's a fine line too between, you know, acknowledge a problem, saying we're working on it, and not doing enough.
And I think that there's also a red line. I mean, there needs to come a point where there's a fine line and a red line where you can take a supplier so far, but ultimately, if you're not going to change the behaviour, then of course, the last resort is to terminate the relationship. I agree with you that where there's an opportunity to change business, to change their approach, then I think that's the power of the leverage that us businesses have, is to change some of that behaviour.
So I just want, if I can, just broaden it, because I think there's no question good supplier management is really, really important. It's important not only for these incredibly compelling moral reasons, there's also a huge number of economic drivers which make it sensible around supply chain transparency and economies of scale and access to markets, and. So there's lots of reasons why that trend plays into it. But for me, I think there's a broader point about how you address this, which is recognizing that it is endemic. Okay, this is not something that a company, in terms of just managing its supply chain, is going to solve this problem. Okay, this is deeply criminal behavior, and is in many cases rooted in a lot of geopolitical reasons that are there. And what we have to do is work together collaboratively on the sort of core salient, for me, human rights issues that sit behind this, and work on those and get that language understood in order to unlock the problem. So, for example, I'm sort of going to sound like a plug, whatever it's not, but apologies. But we're just starting a project in China. One of our key issues is around worker voice. Okay, and we're co-owned business. We believe in industrial democracy, so it's easy for us to say that. But we believe it. So in China, we're going to go this year over the next sort of 9 months left, I think, of this particular project, to try and get to 1,000 workers in China and just start programs of coaching and working with them on worker voice initiatives. Now, we'll probably fail, right? Yep. This will probably be a disaster, and we probably won't achieve anything. But my God, we'll try and learn something in the trying, and then it's how we share that and build that experience.
Good.
Yeah. Can I just pick you up on one thing, which this question of illegality, because I think this is really important. I think there's a danger that the debate becomes very polarized between illegal activity and legal. And I think what we actually find is that some of this is actually legal. And a lot of the problems we see is rooted in the charging of fees for workers, which in many sending and receiving countries is perfectly legal. But that indebtedness brings a vulnerability that then becomes deeper as you work through. So I think the challenge here is actually some of this is legal, but it's accepted, and we need to try and change the business model of recruitment.
Okay, yeah. No, that's actually good.
Yes, yeah, no, I think I wanted to reflect on a few points there from the investor's perspective. So it's an outside look, and that's where we have trouble trying to identify whether or not a company is genuine in trying to tackle the slavery issue. And as you say, well, the kafala, for instance, is an official way to enslave people and probably legal. That's why we need to go beyond compliance and ask companies to go beyond compliance. But we don't want it to be a tick box approach. And we find that reporting sometimes the flip side of that is that saying we've audited our supply chain, and so we are fairly, because everybody knows it's an issue, we're fairly confident that we are tackling the problem appropriately. So how do we, as investors, we are outsiders, it's really hard, it's really hard to have the right information. How do we assess what is a company doing? Well, there are two ways. First is to talk at company at different levels. First is at board level, to see the tone from the top and how strong the company commitment is. And that gives you already a very good feel of how confident you can be of the reporting that's produced. And the second one is talking with the key people in the company and talking about the audit. What does it mean? Is it investigative auditing? Because we've seen with Nestlé and the fishery scandal in Thailand, but we also saw that with the Rana Plaza. Those were audited facilities. So what is the company doing and with whom the company is working? Because we also recognize that if we are not specialists, it's not also the company's first specialty to deal with human rights. So you've built in strong knowledge, but we want to know with whom you're working.
Right. Now, I'm glad you raised this point of at what level in the company, where does this go? Does it come right from the top? I think this is a critical point. It's something we've talked about when we've discussed many other issues and sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. I assume right from the top at IKEA and John Lewis Partnership.
Well, in our case, this is where we are. I wrote a paper the other day. I called ourselves an historical accident, the partnership, for many reasons, because we're essentially just an experiment from a founder, John Speed and Lewis, who wanted to experiment with employee ownership and industrial democracy. So we actually have a constitution that mandates ultimately our purpose being the happiness of partners employees through worthwhile employment in a successful business. That language opens up a lot of these areas for us, of course, because how can it be worthwhile if it's built off the back of slaves, for example, or indeed trashing rainforests or whatever. These are questions that we have to ask ourselves. And so that creates an imperative to do it. But behind it, of course, is also then a brand association, a brand relationship that we have with our customers. There's no question our customers, when you ask them, they walk into the shop and they thought, well, I'm already now in Peter Jones or Waitrose or Oxford Street or anywhere in the country and going, well, I've made my ethical choice. I've gone and shot to the plant.
How often is this discussed at the very senior levels at IKEA?
We have a governance structure. We have a code of conduct called IWay, and we have a governance structure around that, which is led by the chief executive and other members of the board. And they would meet quarterly to discuss IWay and anything to do with compliance of that code of conduct. So the highest level. And just building on I think in a way you've got a bit of two dull examples from the corporate perspective, because we're both private companies. And therefore it affords us I think we can probably use the moral argument more at all levels. And also, we don't have investors in the same way that other companies do. So I think in a way, we can also take longer term decisions. So at IKEA, it's not unusual to have a 7-8 year business case.
But do you feel you come under less scrutiny as a result of being a private company?
I think we have in the past.
And does that give you an excuse somewhere down the line?
I think it has in the past, but I think that's changed a lot in the last few years.
I think the brand, you're looking at also some very strong retail brands that very much exposed, and we're the first to be named. There's a shot of us in a Country File report yesterday, actually. Okay. There was a Country File last night. They were speaking about fake farms and had a shot of Waitrose, and we don't use fake farms, right? We just put Waitrose on it. We don't say Waitrose Farms unless it is actually our farm. But at the end, we get named alongside everybody else anyway.
Is there a fear, Nick, and I'll come to all of you as well on this, a basic fear of reporting too much information? I mean, Nestle has been thrown around as an example of a company that really fessed up to finding quite a lot of this in its supply chains. And it got some pretty bad press as a result of it. Is there a concern that if you go too far the other way, you're going to be under way too much scrutiny from the public, which might affect the brand, or from investors that might affect the share price?
Well, as an activist and an NGO, that's not really kind of at the forefront of our concerns, right? I'm sure that's the concerns of the brands and others. I mean, look, and I used to be a corporate lawyer. I used to work for Goldman Sachs. I kind of come to this with a corporate mindset as well. From my mind, and these are strong consumer-facing brands that are doing good work. They have to, and they are. But I see our role as, and working with others, in changing the cost-benefit equation for firms so that they do have to do this, right? So that there will be real costs if it's discovered that there is slavery in a supply chain. If they have done all their excellent audits and yet you have Rana Plaza was, health safety issue, but you have a kind of a scandal about massive exploitation despite all of these processes, it's going to be a massive issue. We are trying to change that cost-benefit equation so that it is dealt with at the boardrooms, not just of well-meaning companies, but the challenge is to get to those that actually don't want to do this stuff, those that won't file their reports under the Modern Slavery Act, won't just say not that we're not doing anything, but won't file them at all. And that's what I want to talk about. I mean, that's why I'm kind of talking about changing regulatory environment and the scrutiny and the Pope and the Prime Minister and everyone kind of raising the threshold of and the cost of not doing this properly.
Okay, go ahead, Ms. Dash.
I think the question is twofold. The first one is the quantity versus quality. So we understand that the issue is very different from one company to another, even in the same sector, depending on their own supply chain, business model, products, and everything. And so it has to make sense. It has to provide, the company has to provide the appropriate information rather than overload us with information we can't read and understand. So that in itself, I could speak for a long time on that. And I think on the flip side of this is transparency, and why we believe that it is important for a company to take the issue and put it publicly. It's because we rely, and everybody does rely, on the different media for information, and you find that some rating agency will come up with the same issue over and over again, and something that happened in 2013 is still affecting your rating. So Nestlé knows that really well. It has had a long history because also it's one of the biggest cap. So, and it has the means and the fact that it's retail, it can affect its bottom line. So it has everything, all the argumentation to put the case publicly and do it appropriately.
I mean, it's this idea, damned if you do, damned if you don't, with Nestle. You know, this idea that there's a risk that progressive companies will become the targets of the NGOs. I mean, where does that rank in your concerns, you two? Go ahead.
I mean, I think there's more of a danger of having the usual suspects on stage all the time. And I think there's a definite need for corporate leadership and corporate transparency, 100%. But the problem when you do get the usual suspects is a feeling that you have it cracked. And I think that's important that both of us are humble in saying that we haven't got it cracked. But also that you end up with a very long tail. I think that is a danger with this debate, especially when you focus purely on transparency, is that there may only be a few who are willing to stand up and take the slaps and take the hits. But if you have a level playing field, then you want that long tail as well.
So I'm going to I've said my previous life, I was at Greenpeace. I was their chief policy advisor in the UK. So some experience of NGO campaigning on the other side of the fence, as it were. And let's not be naive about this. I'm very supportive of it. But NGOs will campaign for the biggest story. And they'll go after the people that's going to have the biggest brand as a result of that. So it's always going to be us or IKEA or whoever is Nestlé in the firing frame, because inevitably that's the biggest point of influence, and that's what an NGO is trying to do, because there's limited resources and they want to have that maximum point of impact. And so that's there. And I think that's where that's a constant calculation on any number of things. But then you might have which coming out about pricing. We have put out on Waitrose, you've got the Sun putting their basket of a cost of goods out every day in terms of how much Waitrose costs against an Aldi or Lidl. So that's a constant brand calculation that has to be made. I think the interesting question, if I may go back a step and talk about risk on this, one of the reasons I'm slightly cautious about this risk opportunity narrative or frame for this is twofold. Firstly, the opportunity bit just makes me sick. How can you say I've got a business opportunity in dealing with slavery? I mean, that just makes me sick morally, actually. I just think it's wrong. This is terrible. It needs to be done. We need to do what we can about it. Of course, there are risks associated with this. And of course, if there were major problems found, there are major risks to your brand, to your reputation, to your ability to trade and your license to operate, which is why having a progressive position, I think, is important in part of that discussion. Yeah. But the caution is, I don't know when you last looked at a corporate risk register, okay? There's a hell of a lot on it. And you start sitting there saying, okay, it's fine, I've got myself a place on the risk register. Well, that's fantastic. I'll get 5 minutes with the Audit and Risk Committee once a year. Right?
Right.
And I think there is there's a slight warning that you get yourself driven down to a particular place.
And also, it means your response is a risk-based response,
yeah,
which normally drives you down a compliance route, which arguably won't tackle this problem.
But I come back to, and apologies if this sounds a little bit crude, a little bit naive, but very much with a layperson's hat on. When we talk about risk, and we talked earlier, Simon, about the changing suppliers, if you found forced labour in the supply chain. If you say to your suppliers, all your suppliers, right, we really need total clarity here, total transparency, and at the end of the day, that might mean changing half of your suppliers, would you do it?
Would we do it, or would the suppliers?
Would any of the big corporates do it? Would the private companies do it? Would the public companies do it? I mean, that is a big risk. That's the sort of risk I'm talking about here.
Well, let's be absolutely clear what the implications of asking that question are. What you're really asking is, I want to guarantee that everybody there, nobody is going to lie to me.
Right.
Okay? So I went to visit a factory. I went to go visit factories in India the other day. We thought we went to the factory. This wasn't a factory.
Yeah. But surely the important point here is you've got to ask the question. And if you don't ask the question,
oh, sure.
You shouldn't be sitting in the positions that you two are in, right?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, for sure.
So you're asking the question.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
I think most companies are already asking the question. I think the devil is in what you do with the response and how deep you want to go. And I think that's the other thing with this is once you start opening the box, you're going to find things. And the question then is how do you respond to those? I think most companies here will be asking the question, actually.
And it's not asking the question of your direct supplier, the first tier. Right? So if you go to a company that's manufacturing garments in India and say that we need to make sure you don't have any forced labour in your factory. Well, if you're a good client, if you're a good customer, if you're buying much of their supply, they will do that, right? It's worth their while. The question, of course, the really hard one is none of your suppliers, you, the first tier company, are using forced labour. And so they'll go to their second tier suppliers who will say, well, hold it. If you want us to make sure that we're complying with all of these standards, etc., that's going to cost money. You're not going to offer us any more money. We'll just supply to the Bangladeshi or the Chinese company that, in fact, is not going to ask these questions.
Right.
So it's going to cost money, right? It's going to be more expensive to build in the incentives for these companies to go through tier 1, tier 2, 3, 4, 5, right? That is what I talk about, I think.
But I'm really uncomfortable with this. Sorry to just challenge you.
Go ahead.
I feel really uncomfortable about this. You're trying to make assumptions there that it is possible, okay, in an auditing or compliance-based approach to drive out essentially immoral, lying, criminal behaviour or immoral behaviour by suppliers through their supply chain. So I could give you an audit trail. Okay,
Yeah.
so, and this isn't a plea of complexity, although, modern supply chain is incredibly complex if you actually get beyond, as you know very well, beyond the first tier. Think about how many bits go into a suit, how many suppliers go in. I mean, our grape supply chain has 8 countries and we move around the world. It's incredibly complicated. But you're actually asking, you're saying, hold on here, I want to guarantee that you are not going to lie to me. Okay, and that's a totally different transaction because they will lie to you. These you'll go in, you'll say, actually, I want to go and see where you make this. Fantastic. Okay, so how do you get that beading on that nice dress for the girls' occasional wear that we sell? They say, oh, that goes to home workers.
Okay. So where does that leave us?
Okay, but there's 2 questions. First of all,
we have to do with the endemic issues.
Absolutely, but if you're not saying that there aren't incentives to do the right thing, right? It's not going to work to say do the right thing to second, third tier suppliers, right? You've got to accept that, of course, you need the checks and balances. In my organisation, small organisation, a Freedom Fund, been going for 2.5 years, we now fund over 100 NGOs in developing countries that are working in these environments. If you really want to know what's going on in your supply chain, you talk to some of the 7,000 community groups that we support directly and ask the people who are working in a factory. It can be done, right? It's expensive, though. This is what I'm saying. It's not expensive. It takes a different way of doing business. Correct. We can put you in touch with people who will very quickly tell you, boom.
Which is why we work a voice in China.
Exactly.
When we engage with a company, when we're trying to probe whether or not they are truly committed to go further and beyond compliance, some of the questions we ask are with whom you're working locally and what's the capacity building you have, the trainings. But also what we ask is how do you incentivize your buyers? If they have this type of indicators and this type of objectives, then we gain more confidence into how it's done. So, but working with local NGOs that can tell you beyond the suppliers what's going on in the community and help you have a better understanding of the real impact of the corporate action on the ground, we find makes a difference.
Could I make just one thing about the recruitment industry, because I think the recruitment industry is critical. And what we find actually is when we talk to our suppliers in the receiving countries, where there are migrant workers, often the suppliers genuinely believe that the workers have not been charged fees. But when you actually dig much deeper into the sending countries, you find the workers have been charged fees. But there's many, many layers of agents and sub-agents, and there is criminality in the recruitment industry. So I think for me, that's a critical industry that needs to be part of this debate. You seldom see recruitment agents on the stage, but unless we change the business model of recruitment, we're not going to be able to solve this issue.
But as Nick was saying, that's expensive. That's costly.
And
that is often, I would imagine, at the end of the day, a stop for
I'm not sure, because the thing I have at the moment, workers pay for a job opportunity. They are often very vulnerable and sometimes ill-educated and sometimes can't read. They have no ability to challenge the recruitment agent. If you professionalise the service and the employer pays for that fee, there comes with it a professionalisation of the services. And I actually think the true cost of recruitment will be nothing like the recruitment fees you're seeing the workers are paying now. So I think that's really actually, it may actually be cheaper. In fact, it definitely will be cheaper. It's just that the employer will pay instead of the worker.
There needs to be a lot more research around this. I find this whole recruitment, people will think, if you're not familiar with this issue, that recruitment, very kind of arcane issue. But if you're a major construction company in Qatar building a stadium for the World Cup, right, you will basically have a recruitment company that will come to you and say, we can supply you with the 2,000 workers you need each month for free, right? And they will go offer that contract off to a recruiter in Nepal and India who will demand fees. Those fees are used to pay bribes, by the way, all the way through the process. And a fee goes to the recruitant, who then supplies them, no questions asked, to the construction company. And so now I have to think that there is a way of doing this whereby the profits aren't being made by the criminal elements, as long as you're willing to invest in the whole recruitment process. And there are massive costs around the bribery and the corruption and the illegality. And I think that if you're a major construction company in the Middle East now, you want to get on top of your recruitment processes because of the bribery components, and you can't deny knowledge now of the risks around all of this issue. And Apple has been doing some really good work in China. Now, it's prepared to invest because it's an expensive consumer-facing brand, but it's doing some very, very good work around ensuring that no recruitment fees are paid and insisting that the factories repay the recruitment fees. So, the investment of the time and the willingness and the incentives to do so. And I do come back to the incentives. It's not just, I kind of see business, and without being pejorative, I see business as being amoral in this space, and it's about making it the right thing for them to do in terms of the various stakeholders they have to serve.
I think on that there are two very interesting points that I want to make. We are universal owners, so we're invested in most of the biggest caps across the world. We truly are, from the Asian company to the American companies who are all acting globally. We have a huge interest to have these companies working together, trying to bring change and share costs. So we are also trying to support industry activities, and I think that's one of the only way this can make this can be an effective and truly game-changing corporate approach. And the second thing that we also believe is important is the company advocacy work towards the countries in which they are operating. Because, as you mentioned, Nick, it's often a weak rule of law. But if you have, and then also you mentioned that I find really, really interesting, the cultural issues around slavery. So often it's rooted in the history of the company, in the countries of which the company are operating in. And we believe that it's easier for corporation to lobby for a stronger rule of law, to make change happen, which happened with the kafala. It's because of the company's pressure that the rule was strengthened. And it's a message that comes across much more naturally than if it comes from the civil society or the Occidental politicians. Because if you put a money rationale behind it, we want to secure our supply chain. We want to make sure we have on-time delivery of good quality goods we can rely on. We want to make sure there's no scandal so that our customers are not running away from us because there's a scandal in The Guardian. Then you come in with a kind of neutral argumentation that carries a much stronger weight than any of the NGOs or politicians. So I think the corporates have a true lever to play here. Yep. And so we as investors, we are trying to, when we push a company, we are also trying to make it helpful for them so that they can come with a letter of the investors, see a government, which Total told us that had been tremendously helpful in some cases, for instance. So companies recognize that. We are trying to help bring change by supporting companies' work and companies' action in this field.
I'm very wary of the time, and there's a few other bits and pieces I want to touch on. Collaboration is something we heard Norman talk about, and you talked about it as well. Collaboration among the businesses, but then, of course, with civil society and with regulators and with law enforcement, etc. What sort of collaboration? You're ranking this now. Where have we reached, and where do we need to reach?
again, it comes back to changing incentives. I mean, businesses are loath often to collaborate because they're cutthroat competitors, but then there are environments in which hopefully there is a perceived benefit in collaboration. So for instance, in somewhere like southern India, where there is significant exploitation in the cotton mills and so on, and it exists because there is a lack of government enforcement, because inspections aren't being done or they aren't being done properly. It's actually in the interest of the brands for those inspections to happen, because the brands at first tier want to be compliant, but there are the other big corporates from other countries that aren't particularly concerned about this. So, there isn't a level playing field because you can commit these abuses and get away with it. Or in Thailand, I'm sure most of the major supermarket brands and so on that are supplying Thai fish would welcome much stronger regulation across the board, and they would all be unified in that because they are struggling with those issues there, and China recruitment being the same kind of thing. So there are incentives. It's just getting beyond that, competitive mindset to say on this issue there is a benefit to collaboration.
Well, let's hear from you guys on this.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more strongly that collaboration is absolutely key to solving this, and I think I slightly shy away also from, the leadership opportunity language that can exist around this sometimes, because, leadership actually incentivizes not sharing, incentivizes trying to get out there and trying to, edge yourself slightly further of IKEA in terms of the quality of your products. But it is constant in the sector. Yeah. But so we have to. It's about sharing the results, the output of what you've been doing and what you've been working on to do that. I just want to echo actually what was just said a few minutes ago by Natasha and by Grant Thornton on business needing to find its voice here. And I don't think we have really found our voice yet on it. There's still a lot of nervousness. There's still a lot of in boardrooms of, oh my gosh, can we admit this? What's the risk of being being too exposed on these issues? And actually, that strength to sort of say, actually, how do you get that commercial voice on a plane and go and create the political pressure on the Thai government around,
But is this
that's where we have to be better.
Actually, it works because thanks to companies' pressure, but also external political pressure, I think the Thai government has strengthened its law, whether or not it's actually making a difference. But it has had an impact.
Is there, at the risk of sounding really cynical about this, is there still way too much denial among the corporates themselves that this is a really big problem that they need to address? Is there too much denial?
I think it's a question of priorities and bringing it further in the agenda. I think the regulation is going to make is a game changer. So denial,
that flies in the face of what you think, really, doesn't it?
Because any corporate would. I don't think anyone in any corporation will say my supply chain is totally free of slave labor. I think everybody knows that it's an issue, but it's a question of tackling it and putting the means behind it and having a strategic approach to it, which could mean changing business model, or it's just a question of bringing it to the strategic level. Yeah. It might not be relevant for each and every company either, so we are trying to be cautious and not. When we're discussing with companies, we want them to make the best use of our money, which is yours as well. It's your pensions. So we think it's definitely important. There's no, but as to how it's tackled, when we are going to ask for more, it depends on which company it is, and how we perceive the risks as well.
Do you turn a blind eye to anything?
We have to prioritize our resources as well. We don't turn back. If there's a major issue, scandals or reputation risk, we're there. Of course, we are there. But we are hoping that we can go beyond that. And most.
But you've got in this room a room full of CSR specialists and sustainability experts. If I could just say, we're talking to our own community here, aren't we? Broadly in this very, very impressive group. And I think that one mustn't rule out the fact that actually our role as critical functions in businesses is to say the unpalatable thing and to try and fight it up the agenda by doing that. Those are the scars we take on our backs in our jobs, is to go in there and to try and push and say, actually, how do you keep that fear level higher in the business? And this is definitely
even if it means an irate CFO and CEO.
Quite, well, that would be an unusual day in the office if they weren't.
Can I just come to this partnership thing? Because I think on many of these stages we often talk about partnership, and I think why is that necessary? I think it's because we're talking about a big systemic issue with many different layers of complexity. And most of our corporate response to that is a compliance response. And ultimately, that is not going to solve it. And so some of these root causes, like if you take one route, the recruitment industry, IKEA is not going to transform the recruitment industry on its own. But potentially 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 big companies could actually make a big impact on that. So I think it's looking, what are the root causes of some of these issues? Because we're trimming the branches.
I want to get a quick word on technology and the way technology and the collation of data and big data and the information, the sort of thing Thomson Reuters does, among others, how that's changing and helping this happen more quickly. Go ahead.
Yeah, it has real potential. It's just that, technology needs data, and often that data doesn't exist. I mean, we work in rural Bihar, right, where NGOs are taking down information on pen and paper, and it's not available. And we're talking with Thomson Reuters, right, along with other NGOs who want more visibility about what's happening at the community level and wants to talk with the people who know what's coming on and off the boats. Well, that information often isn't there in kind of, electronic form. And to be honest, the local NGO that is dealing with the survivors that you saw there isn't interested in collecting that information to supply to Thomson Reuters. No. Thomson Reuters also has to incentivize those to provide the information. They're interested in helping the survivors and getting them back to their home. And so, I see change happening in this industry, but it's going to be a long time coming. And any idea that there is a quick technological fix, which I know you're not saying, but is, as I've got deeper into this space, just understood, technology is a tool, it's a powerful tool, but you need the underlying kind of data and substance that it can build upon.
I would agree. I think technology could be a red herring, and we've seen that with the worker voice debate. People often jump on technology, worker hotlines, and I agree. I think it's a tool, but ultimately it might not solve the root causes of the problem. Okay. It's just a tool.
Yeah, and I know, and just very quickly, I know we're jumping around a little bit, but other incentives. I know there's someone in this audience who and the startup called Halo Trade. This idea of linking the cost of finance to human rights as a way to move this forward. In fact, Natasha, let me get your thoughts on that.
We
something like that
are
work?
starting. I think we're also at a tipping point in responsible investment. I think what was a niche is becoming more and more mainstream. I think there is some concrete examples have shown that there are some costs not taking these issues into account. We ourselves are mainstream investors for most of our funds. We have specialist funds, and we believe it makes a difference in our risks and returns. And I think human rights, I think climate is a better example of that. I think it's more mature, and I think we're getting there with climate. We're not there yet. I think human rights are still has way to go. I can't think of a proper model, whereas there's an obvious one now in climate, and we are asked to assess the carbon footprint of our portfolio, to bring together a strategy as to how we are going to decrease it without getting rid of the energy investments. And so there's a carbon price that is coming into the investment decision making within the company, but also within the investment community. So I think this is more mature. Yeah. On human rights, I can't think of a model already.
Okay. Do you want to say something?
Yeah. So I went to Kathmandu in June and took along some investors and some bankers, a very smart banker friend of mine. We were looking at commercial sexual exploitation of children, massive industry of sexually exploiting, sexually abusing, raping children, brothels, massage parlours, cabin restaurants. And this guy was asking, okay, well, are these restaurants, are these massage parlours getting finance from local banks? And invariably they were, or lines of credit. Those local banks are getting finance, wholesale finance, from international banks. Right? That has not yet been documented or tracked. But it opens up another supply chain issue around finance that we will start putting on the agenda. I'm sure others will start putting on the agenda around.
We've started with banks.
Exactly. And it's going to be around know your client. It's going to be around money laundering and definitions of issues. And
know your clients.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience in just a second. Very, very quickly, but Natasha, I'd be interested to hear from you and from you, Nick, putting you on the spot a little bit, but among the investments you make and the corporates you invest in, Just give us one or two names of best in class in terms of who is doing really well and who the others here can strive towards.
I think Unilever has come up with a very interesting human rights report. I think what Nestlé has done with the cocoa chain, supply chain, and with the fish supply chain in Thailand is also very interesting. I think those are good examples.
Okay.
We are trying to find best practice in order to have good points of comparisons, and I think that's where we're struggling as well. Where to find those very good practice that we could say, well, compare the others to.
What about you, Nick?
Look, without trying to be political about this, I think it's great that we've got IKEA and John Lewis on stage. 2 years ago, to be honest, I think that we would struggle to get this kind of representation on this stage talking about these issues. And I know because at Trust Women Conference and others, we struggle to get high-level corporate openness talking about these issues. So, I mean, congratulations to them, Unilever, others that are willing to talk about it. I won't single out any champion because every company that's taking this issue seriously has real problems, right? The issue is not that you have a clean supply chain. The issue is that you're taking the issue seriously and that you're willing to address it when your proper investigation reveals that there are problems to be addressed. That's the approach that we need to see.
Okay, very good.